Gathered friends, welcome to Bionicle Fanon Reviews, the show where I build, review, and showcase every single one of the fan-created, canonized Bionicle models over the entirety of Bionicle Generation 1's 10-year run. If it's canon, it's fair game for these reviews. Or is it? Because, you know, as you can probably tell by clicking on this thumbnail and taking a look at this video, the model in question for review today is not canon. We do not have any sort of physical depiction for it, it probably will never be physically depicted, and it really just comes from one person's or the mockist's imagination. So why, may you ask, am I reviewing this for Bionicle Fanon Reviews? Well, honestly, I kind of figured like it was time for a bit of a mix-up. I've been reviewing all sorts of the Dark Hunters and Rahi for so long, and honestly, I was getting a little tired of it. And I could probably tell some of you were a little bit tired of seeing these same old MOCs always toppling over, really poor building techniques clearly built by children and limited by the parts of 2005, where even the best of them are not really even close to some of the fantastic MOCs that can be seen today. And so, to change things up a little bit, I decided why not actually review other people's MOCs if they've posted instructions for them, either for purchase or for free. If it's out there, if it's something I like, I honestly think it might make sense to review for this channel. Now, of course, this is not really something I plan to do too often. It's really only when a MOC catches my eye, because personally, I'm really oriented towards collecting canon builds. It's very, very rare that I actually go out of my way to purchase and build and review a model from Bionicle that is not canon whatsoever. So you can be assured that the ones I'm reviewing are gonna be really good. But I definitely don't know if you guys are interested in this. Please let me know in the comments below if this is the sort of thing that you like seeing, if you're okay with seeing me reviewing some random other Bionicle MOCs that aren't necessarily canon but still look cool enough or could fit within the general Bionicle world. It's something I personally will continue to build for myself, but do let me know if you want to see reviews of these. Now, of course, this does not mean that Fanon Reviews is ending or stopping. Instead, I'm just going to try to change things up a little bit and alternate. Maybe some weeks we'll have an actual canon Bionicle model, and other weeks will feature someone's MOC that they posted instructions for that I wanted to do to change things up a little bit. Again, subject to the comments below, really interested in hearing your thoughts, but for now I figured why not start things off with a classic WombatCombatPictures MOC. He is an excellent builder who actually designed the official canon Artaka MOC, as well as a fantastic Karzani MOC, which I did review in the past that also isn't technically canon, but now we're veering off into the territory of completely non-canon whatsoever, just someone's own imagination. And that's where things can get really, really interesting, because you're not limited by the story, you're not necessarily limited by a certain color scheme or depiction. You really can just do what you want. And that's what WombatCombatPictures did when he designed the Great Beings I'm about to review. So, throughout Bionicle history, the Great Beings have always been these very elusive characters. Personally, I hope that they never ever get final canon depictions. I think it'll detract from their mystery and intrigue if you put kind of a face to the name, but I think personally that this is a really cool depiction, and that's why, even if it isn't necessarily canon in my mind, it's a really cool build, and I figured why not review it for the channel. For every Bionicle Fanon review, I rank the builds by 4 key points. Number 1 is posability. Can the model get in good poses? Can it support its own weight? And can it hold the weight of its own weapons, or is it just falling over? Number 2 is building techniques. Is the model just regurgitating stuff from existing LEGO sets, or is it trying something new and doing that well as using unique parts usages? Number 3 is overall aesthetics. How good does the model look completely agnostic of storyline relevance, and is it generally aesthetically appealing? And finally, number 4 is believability in universe, which means that does the storyline given to the model by the Bionicle story team make sense given how the model is built, and does the model scale well next to some representative samples from the Bionicle universe? And with that, let's consider these 4 points and more as we jump into a brief story and lore explanation of today's featured build. So the first model we have up here is the Cursed Great Being. Now this is actually a character who is canon in Bionicle lore. Be sure to check out some of the later story serials if you want to learn more about him, but the Cursed Great Being never had a name in Bionicle canon. He didn't really do too much. He was basically featured in this whole cursed tower on Bota Magna. Some of the main characters teleported in, had a few conversations with him, and then the story serials wrapped up, and we never really find out what happened to him. So all we know is he was cursed because he touched the Kanohi Ignika Mask of Life, causing everything around him to come to life, including the chains that bind him to his tower. So that's kind of what drove him mad. And that's all we know. But this time, in Wombat Combat Pictures' mind, he has a name, he has a backstory, and he has a full build. So let's dive into that right now. Alright, so here we have Wombat Combat Pictures' Cursed Great Being, aka Tomidas. In the official Bionicle canon, he is only known colloquially as the Cursed Great Being, but of course Wombat Combat Pictures has given him a full name and a more detailed backstory. But now let's just start things off with the MOC itself. So, as usual, let's kick things off with point number 1, which is posability. So, first of all, starting with the legs here, you'll notice that it pretty much has fairly standard articulation for the most part. You can bend the legs the full 90 degree here, so that's really good to see. And you can stretch them out the full 180 degrees, so it's a really good way to actually articulate the knees here. We're off to a great start. You can see it has very, very bulky legs, but they definitely work to its favor. And the feet as well can be moved around and bent on a slightly more restricted axle, but nothing less than what I would actually expect. So pretty much the legs and feet are off to a great start. It is very, very posable, and I don't really have any complaints about how the legs are posed. Now, in terms of stability of this model, this is actually pretty stable, I have to say. Despite not actually using any of the friction joints or any actual friction extenders, this actually does stand up and balance well on its 2 feet. It's a pretty well-proportioned character. You can take it and play around with it and stuff won't fall off, so that already earns it a lot of points, because a lot of times really good-looking MOCs like these eventually have some sort of posability issues or stability or fragility issues, and thankfully those just are not present for this MOC. It is just an all-around really great build. So moving up to the shoulders here, they actually do have a pretty interesting way of articulating these particular pieces. Now, you may notice that the armor here can actually be moved around somewhat. This is actually intentional because it's almost like shoulder armor. You can kind of flex this a little bit. I wouldn't recommend flexing it too much because, again, it does kind of tend to droop down just a little bit, and if you do move it around a lot, some of the armor pieces on the back will just kind of fall off, and we'll get to those later when we get to building techniques, but for the most part, it just stays together pretty well. Now, as I move along here, let's just kind of get this guy back up to a regular standing pose. We can first start off by taking a look at the arm's posability. So, moving the arm here, you can see it has fairly standard posability, but unfortunately, this does mean that some pieces can fall off. For example, the Hero Factory armor pieces, or the CCBS pieces, are really just clipped on. They're not actually attached on the ball joint. Clipped onto the Mata foot piece here, which is an excellent connection. I didn't even know you could do that connection, but that does result in it falling off if you just bend the arm up too far, which definitely is a bit of a con for this model, but as long as you're careful with it, don't make the upper elbow actually hit it too much, then you're generally pretty good. And you can actually get it pretty up there. It's almost 90 degrees as you can see without it falling off, so I'm not too concerned. Moving on to the hand, you can actually rotate this pretty much with the standard amount of articulation. He does have this kind of optional flame piece that you can have inserted in between his fingers. You don't have to have it, but it's almost like some sort of energy that's coming out of his hands, which I just think is a pretty cool addition here. And again, you can really move these shoulders a little bit up and down to actually have him have a little bit more articulation than expected, so this is pretty nice to see. The other arm works exactly the same way because they are built the same way. So you can see this here. Unfortunately, sometimes, especially if you're using slightly older pieces, you can see the shoulder will tend to droop because all of this is hinged on just one ball joint, which is a little bit unfortunate. There's nothing really keeping this in a particular place, so it does tend to droop down just a little bit, but it isn't really that noticeable, so it's not that big of an issue for me, especially when you actually can get this upwards to a fairly good pose. Then you just need to be careful about pivoting the upper arm around this socket here versus actually just allowing the entire shoulder to pivot. So cool that we have the articulation, but sometimes it's a little more trouble than it's worth, and honestly, I may have been happier if they just fixed the articulation here. Now the hand, again, is pretty much just the same, except this one is holding a sword attached by a Technic pin. It's a pretty standard sword, and we'll get to it when we talk about building techniques, although there are some fun detailing with it. And finally, we can move up to the head. So if I can keep these shoulder pads completely secure here by holding this down, let's just take a look at the way the head articulates. So it actually has a pretty long neck here, and that's because there are a few joints that particularly hold the cape in, but of course, once it's all bent down, you don't even really notice that he has such a long neck as long as you kind of push it forwards, and this gives you a really good range of articulation. This really feels to me like the character is alive and has a lot of expression and personality to him just by how much he can move his head, kind of quickly swiveling it to look in one direction, maybe looking up at the camera, looking down, kind of looking to the side. All sorts of completely crazy and unique poses you can get just out of moving the head around. So that is really cool for posability, at least to me personally. But then we can move on to building techniques. And this has a lot of really interesting building techniques here. So first of all, immediately some stuff that will probably stand out to you is the inclusion of the smaller scale Glatorian Legends Kanohi Ignika in the center chest plate there. That is such a cool addition because, of course, if you know the Great Being's backstory, especially this particular character's backstory from Bionicle, he was literally cursed by the Ignika to bring to life everything that he goes around, so that definitely is a good kind of visual callback to that. Unfortunately, it does mean that it is a little bit gappy when you're looking at it just from the top down because of the way the nature of these pieces work together, but looking at it straight on, it isn't too noticeable, and it does look really awesome like this. Of course, he's also using some of the Kanohi mask pieces on these sides here. That's a really cool way of using these pieces. And you do actually have articulation here, so you can articulate these around. I don't know why you would want to, but just in case you wanted to get it in slightly different poses, it is possible to do it like this and really bend it around the particular pieces. Moving on to the back here, let's lift the cape up, and one thing I really love is just how well this piece is integrated using the Hukimari mask piece. The Mask of Gravity here is something I was not expecting to be used on the back of this model, but it really ties it all together. And I love the use of the mask on the back of the torso to make up the torso construction, as well as, of course, the head itself, which has been slightly modified to at least make it very separate from Hukimari. And speaking of the head, one thing I really love is just how well the different pieces work together. If we get this chain back around his chin, it really does feel almost like he's wearing some sort of a helmet, or the chain is part of his design. And of course, using the Paraka skull in conjunction with the Hukimari piece definitely makes him feel very different compared to, of course, Hukimari himself. So it definitely is something that really makes this character stand out, really does make him feel fresh and unique. Definitely not like something we've seen from Bionicle before, which is really great, especially when you're using limited pieces, which only existed in particular sets. So then moving onwards to the back here, the only complaint I have about the armor pieces and the way they work on the back is that these particular trans purple CCBS armor pieces are really fragile, super easy just to actually get them unclipped and so you can very easily accidentally knock these off, and honestly, they don't really do too much. I could have very easily just done without them. I guess they add a little bit of extra armor here, but they just fall off so easily, it's almost just a pain to pay attention while playing around with this to not knock them off, especially because everything else is very sturdy. You can really play with this character, get him in all sorts of wacky poses, and nothing's really going to fall off except for those top shoulder armor pieces. So that is a bit of a shame, but then moving on to the arms themselves, while the upper arms are fairly simple, maybe a little bit too simple because they're just using the standard CCBS armor pieces, I generally do like the building techniques used for the rest of this. Of course, kind of annoying how this piece just keeps falling off, but what can you do about that? It is a cool technique, and again, I do like the way that this piece is used, the Mata foot in conjunction with the Beast Claw and the CCBS piece here, all to form a very coherent arm structure. If anything though, the arms do feel like they are placed a little bit too far low. I get that this is supposed to angle upwards for the shoulders, but given the amount that the shoulders actually droop downwards, it does end up feeling like the arms are mounted really almost way too low. So I don't know how necessarily this could have been fixed, maybe just by fixing the angle of these pieces upwards a little bit more to actually make it such that it stays in this position, and then you have arms that kind of feel like they're armored in the right places. But as it is right now, with how easily these pieces can just droop downwards, and look at that, I knocked off the top armor piece just by kind of sticking my finger back there and moving it around, so not everything is absolutely perfect here. And then we can move on to the building techniques for the legs. So taking a look at the leg construction here, this is something that I am very impressed with, because
One thing it is that it's very bulky, but it also allows for basically the full range of articulation, and that is definitely requiring a lot of skill here. You can see that the conjunction of the Borak eyepiece right here fits perfectly in the gap right here, so it's a really good thing to see, especially the way the legs work. I have pretty much no complaints. Some of the pieces aren't even attached. Like the system pieces here are literally just kind of jammed in there, and they work because they don't fall out. Once you put them in, they're very hard to actually remove, so that's really, really nice to see. Other stuff back here that I do actually like, especially if we move the cape aside with the leg construction, is just how well the system and Bionicle pieces blend together. These are pure system bricks. I mean, they are just regular old system bricks, but are made such that they work very well in the context of this Bionicle character, and you can really feel the unique parts usages, especially when you get into some of the Knight's Kingdom armor pieces here, all of which contribute to a very cohesive leg structure. Even the feet themselves, while fairly simple, are definitely something that make it stand out and do continue the color scheme very, very well. And so, with that, we can probably move on to the next logical point, which is talking about the aesthetics of this model as a whole. So, the aesthetics, I think, are generally very good. The color scheme, while not necessarily the most unique color scheme, is definitely pulling off something very, very well with the keyed orange and black combined. We definitely have seen a similar color scheme for some other Bionicle characters, but this really makes it its own. I love the combination of the different colors here, especially using the large Technic panels. I think do a great job of giving this some sort of a large chest, really making this feel very strong with the silhouette of this character, and the cape really ties it all together. I feel like the cape really just completes this character, makes him look really, really menacing, has a very unique feel to it, so I am a big fan of how this turned out. Of course, the usage of the Paraka headpiece in conjunction with the Hukimari mask is a very good one. I love the way the yellow and black really blend together. It definitely was inspired by the mask piece here, combining key orange and black and really just taking that idea and running with it. And the other thing I love is the accent color of transparent purple. That is a color that you don't see too often in conjunction with some of these other models, and I think it's a really cool one and works out very well for this model as a whole. And so I'm pretty happy with the overall aesthetics of this. Of course, when the shoulders droop, it doesn't look too great, but if you can get the shoulders to stay up in the right position, then it looks fantastic. And I am very happy with the way this turned out. And finally, we can move on to the last point, which is believability in universe. And to do so, I've brought alongside just one very simple comparison. Toa Haga Norik right here, just so you can see kind of how this scales next to a standard Inika/Metru type build. And again, as you can see right here, similarly to some of the other WombatCombatPictures Great Being MOCs, this is taller than a Toa for sure, but not way too tall and not way too big that it's unbelievable. It's just a very well-built figure in general and scales pretty nicely. It's really just a head taller than the standard Toa builds, which I think makes sense for the Great Beings themselves. One thing I really loved about the Great Being in one of the previous reviews we did, which was Kanohi just a few weeks ago, was just how organic and different and alien this looked compared to one of the standard Bionicle characters. This model, on the other hand, is still a little bit different. You can definitely see some of the more organic and strange influence on it, but I do think that this definitely feels a lot more in line with some of the more other biomechanical pieces, especially because there isn't a clear delineation on this character in terms of what is armor, what's their skin, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something that definitely kind of makes it clash a little bit with the very, very organic form of the previous Great Being that we just reviewed. Now that being said, this definitely does have a lot more unique things going on for it, with the Technic panels and CCBS pieces being very, very smooth in comparison with some of the other more angular and piston detail-oriented pieces for the Toa Haga and just the Toa and Bionicle G1 characters in general. This definitely does have a bit of an otherworldly feel to him, just not so distant, and maybe I kind of wish that they pushed this a little bit further in the strange direction. They are great beings after all. We don't know what they're supposed to look like. They're supposed to be strange entities. Maybe they could have gone a little bit further with just how different this is compared to standard Bionicle characters. And so I am going to give Believability in Universe as a Great Being an 8 out of 10. It's quite good, it's not perfect, but it's pretty cool, and I do like that it's not absolutely massive. It doesn't just tower over standard characters. It's scaled very, very well together. And so, let's just sum up the rest of the points for this model all as a whole. So first off, we have posability. Posability I am almost happy with perfectly except for just one thing. I do think that it's really nice that we can articulate these shoulders, but again, it's kind of annoying when these shoulders actually droop down because then that affects a lot of the other posability of this character. I really could have gone without the shoulder posability here. It is nice to have, but again, almost too much trouble for its worth. Everything else though, I really do like. I love how expressive the head is just by the way you can articulate the neck here. It really does feel like this is a very alive character. He has a lot of personality to him, and that's really all you want out of posability is just being able to get this into fun poses and really be able to play around with the way this works. One thing I do have to mention is that I did say that this is very, very stable and you will typically have no problems posing it. I was kind of talking about that in context of other MOCs. This is definitely one of the most stable MOCs that I've made that have been made by members of the Bionicle community, but it's not perfect. It's by no means as stable as an official set would be because, as you just saw, it's kind of toppling over just a little bit. Still, it's very, very easy to get this back in an upright position, so that doesn't bother me too much. And so, posability is going to get an 8 out of 10 from me. I do think the shoulder articulation could have been toned down just a little bit, or maybe a little bit more friction could have been added onto it, but otherwise I am very happy with how this poses and it looks really fantastic. And then we can move on to building techniques. So the building techniques for this model are pretty stellar, although it's not perfect as I mentioned. Again, it's very easy to accidentally pop off the armor pieces on the elbows here just because of the nature of how they're attached and how they are made in conjunction with each other. And the same goes for the back transparent purple armor here, just very easy to accidentally pop them off. Other than that though, it's pretty good and pretty cohesive. I'm not really scared of playing around with this. Unlike some other models, I'm not afraid that if I touch it, some things will fall off. I'm just pretty happy in general with how this can be built. And of course, the building techniques are really great. Using these pieces as shoulder armor is definitely really cool. Having the Mask of Life embedded inside is a great callback to this character in Bionicle lore. And even the sword itself, which I didn't touch on too much because it's just kind of a basic sword, but it does include some really great detailing like the curvature of these spikes here. Still very simple building techniques, but ones that work really well. And of course, I do actually really like the way that the lower legs are built. I think the legs are some of the coolest parts of this entire build. You rarely ever saw legs as detailed as these for Bionicle characters, so I'm just a big fan of how they work, and it's very impressive that you can achieve the full range of posability without really anything falling off except for this one system piece here, which that's probably closer to my fault because I brushed it with my finger. So they are very, very sturdy for the most part, really able to bend the legs quite a lot, and that is definitely an engineering feat of its own. And so, for building techniques, I'm going to give this model a 9 out of 10. If only the armor pieces stayed on a little bit better, it would be a perfect 10 out of 10, but as of right now, it's pretty darn close, and I am very happy with how this turned out. And finally, the last point here is overall aesthetics, completely agnostic of the storyline as a whole. And I have to say, while the color scheme is nothing too special, it pulls it off very well. I love the blend between the black and heat orange, and I do think it definitely has a good spread throughout the body. Now, not everything is absolutely perfect. I do think that it could have had a little bit more armor, especially on the upper elbows here. I know that the shoulder armor here is kind of supposed to make up for it, but it just ends up feeling like this is very under-armored. It's literally just a standard CCBS shell connection, and honestly, I probably was expecting a little bit more from a MOC like this, where literally everything else is just covered in detail. But beyond that, my only other major complaint is just how low the arms work, especially if you're trying to angle it and pose it. It really is obvious that the arms are mounted pretty low and a lot lower than you'd expect these shoulders to be, especially given how high up the head can be posed. It does feel like these shoulders being mounted this way and the upper arms definitely could have been raised up by even one whole module upwards. Other than that though, I'm very happy with aesthetics, and that's why I'm going to give this a 7 out of 10 in terms of aesthetics. It's not perfect, there are a few things I would change here and there, but overall it is really truly fantastic. And with that, we have summed up our review of WombatCombatPictures' Cursed Great Being. Definitely, if you're interested in building this yourselves, check out a link to WCP's Patreon below, which is really great. He is selling instructions for these and all his other MOCs for only $1 for the lowest Patreon tier level. You can access all of his instructions, which is really fantastic. And of course, let me know down in the comments below, what do you think of this model? Do you like it? Do you dislike it? Or are any of you inspired to build this yourselves? As usual, thank you so much for tuning into Duck Bricks, and stay tuned for even more LEGO news, reviews, discussion, and analyses coming your way very soon. And stay tuned every Monday for a brand new Bionicle fan and review. I'll talk to you again very soon, and bye-bye for now.